Okay, so you ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, today we're tackling something I know a lot of you are thinking about, a lot of you are working on, and that is how to ace those product management interviews.
It's a big one.
It is a huge one, right? And I think there's so much information out there, and it's easy to get lost in all the articles, all the advice, all the different frameworks.
Yeah.
So what we wanted to do is give you a bit of a shortcut, and that's what this deep dive is all about.
Yeah, exactly. We went through a ton of resources all about product management interviews.
Yeah.
We looked at, common scenarios, example answers, all that kind of stuff.
Like how to structure your responses and really like the thinking behind it.
Yeah, and the goal is to come out of this with some really solid insights. Maybe even uncover a few things that you haven't thought about before, so that when you do walk into that interview, you're feeling really confident and ready.
Yeah, and like genuinely informed, right? Like
Yeah.
you've done the work.
Cool.
So this is for you, whether you're, actively prepping for an interview, maybe you're just looking to brush up on your product knowledge, or hey, maybe you're just curious about how this whole product management thing works. We're here to help you get a solid understanding, but quickly.
Yeah.
All right, so I think a good place to start is agile development. I feel like that is like,
You can't escape it.
you can't escape. It's like the foundation of so much
It
of
is.
product work these days.
Absolutely. And I think it can feel like a bit of a buzzword sometimes, but I think it's good to revisit like what it actually means.
Yeah.
And at its core, Agile is about putting people and interactions first,
Yeah.
over processes and tools.
Mhm.
It's about delivering a working product,
Mm.
rather than just documentation. And really importantly, it's about responding to change over following a rigid plan.
And it's so collaborative, right?
Yes, very much so.
Like that constant back and forth.
Yeah, you've got to have those open lines of communication and be working closely together throughout the process.
And I think the key thing there that you said is responding to change like that is
That's where the Agile comes in.
that's the agility, right? And it's so important because things change in product development all the time.
All the time. And I think that's what sets it apart from traditional waterfall methods where everything
Oh.
was kind of, planned out in a very linear way.
Like so set in stone.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas Agile is much more iterative. You're working in short cycles. You're getting feedback. You're adapting as you go.
You know what comes to mind for me as like a real example of agile is Scrum.
Yeah, Scrum is a very popular framework.
It's so common, right?
It's a way of implementing Agile principles in a structured way.
So can you give us a little overview of like how Scrum actually works?
Sure. So Scrum is based on these time box iterations called sprints, which are typically 2 weeks long, although it can vary.
It can vary, yeah.
Um, and each sprint starts with a sprint planning meeting where the team comes together. They look at the product backlog, which is basically a prioritized list of everything that needs to be done, and they decide what they can realistically achieve in that sprint.
Like what they can commit to.
Yeah, exactly. And then throughout the sprint, they have these daily stand-up meetings, which are very short, 15-minute check-ins where everyone shares what they're working on, any roadblocks they're facing, just to keep everyone in sync.
Just to keep everyone on the same page.
Exactly. And then at the end of the sprint, there are two key events. One is the sprint review, where the team demonstrates what they've built to the stakeholders and gets feedback.
So you actually get to see something tangible.
Yeah, you see a working increment of the product. And then the other event is the sprint retrospective, which is really important for continuous improvement.
Yeah, this is where you get to kind of step back and reflect, right?
Exactly. The team discusses what went well, what could be improved, and they come up with actionable steps to make the next sprint even better.
So it's like this constant loop of learning and adapting.
Exactly. And I think that's really the essence of Agile and Scrum.
So we've talked about agile development. We've talked about Scrum now. There's a role that's really crucial in all of this, and that's the product owner.
Oh, yeah, they're at the heart of it.
Right. So can you tell us a bit about what the product owner does? What are their responsibilities?
Sure. So as the name suggests, the product owner really owns the product. They're responsible for defining the vision for the product.
Like the big picture.
Yeah, the big picture.
Yeah.
They're responsible for creating and maintaining the product backlog that we talked about and constantly prioritizing it.
Right, making sure that the most important things are at the top of the list.
Yeah, and they work very closely with stakeholders, which could be customers, business folks, engineers, to make sure everyone is aligned on what needs to be built and why.
So they're kind of like the bridge between all these different groups.
Exactly. They're the voice of the customer. They understand the business goals, and they can translate that into actionable items for the development team.
So when it comes to like actually building the product, The development team is focused on the how, right?
Yeah.
They're figuring out the technical details.
Exactly.
But the product owner is really focused on the what.
The what and the why.
Right, and making sure that what's being built is actually valuable.
Right. Is actually going to meet the needs of the users and the business.
Okay, so let's imagine you're a product owner and you've got this massive product backlog.
Yeah. It can be overwhelming.
Right, there are probably a million things that could potentially be built.
Maybe more.
Right? So how do you decide what actually gets worked on first? What are the key considerations for prioritization in this Agile context?
It's a huge part of the job.
It is a huge part.
And I think a good product owner takes a holistic view. They're not just looking at one thing. They're considering a bunch of factors.
Like what?
So first and foremost, user feedback. What are your users saying? What are they asking for? What are their pain points?
You got to listen to the people who are actually using your product.
Absolutely. Then you've got business goals. What are the company's strategic objectives? How can the product contribute to achieving those?
Yeah, like what's going to move the needle for the business?
Exactly. And then you've also got to consider technical feasibility. Sometimes there are dependencies. Certain things need to be built first before you can move on to others.
Right. So sometimes you can't just build the shiniest feature first.
You have to lay the groundwork.
Right. You might have to do some of the less glamorous stuff first.
Exactly. And there are a bunch of frameworks and techniques that product owners use to help with prioritization.
Our source mentioned the Moscow method. I've always liked that one.
It's a classic. It's simple but effective.
Yeah, it stands for must have, should have, could have, won't have, right?
Exactly. And it's basically a way of categorizing items in your backlog.
So, which ones are absolutely essential, which ones are important but not critical, and which ones can maybe wait?
Yeah, and I think a key insight here is that it's not just about getting all the must-haves done. It's about strategically including some should-haves as well.
Right.
Because those can really enhance the user experience and make your product more competitive.
Yeah, I think that's something I've learned over time is that it's not just about like checking off the boxes.
Right.
It's about making sure that what you're building is actually delightful to use.
Exactly. And it goes above and beyond just the basic requirements.
So we've talked about prioritizing the backlog now. Let's talk about how we actually capture those user needs, and that's where user stories come in.
Yeah, user stories are a really important tool in Agile development.
So can you explain what a user story is and why they're so valuable?
So a user story is basically a short, simple description of a feature or functionality from the perspective of the user.
Right, so it's not a technical specification.
It's not about the code.
Yeah.
It's about the value that the feature provides to the user.
And there's a specific format, right?
Yeah, there's a very common format. It's, as a type of user, I want to perform an action so that I can achieve a goal.
So for example?
For example, as a new user, I want to be able to create an account so that I can start using the app.
Right, so simple, but it tells you who, why, what.
Exactly. And it really helps to keep everyone focused on the user.
Yeah, because sometimes it's easy to get lost in the technical details.
It is. It's easy to get lost in the weeds and forget who you're building for.
And user stories are really helpful for that.
Yeah, they bring it back to the human element.
And they're also great for communication, right?
Yeah, they're a very concise and easy way to communicate requirements across the team.
So everyone's on the same page.
Developers, designers, stakeholders, everyone understands what needs to be built and why.
All right, so we've got our prioritized backlog, we've got our user stories, we're all set to start sprinting.
We're ready to go.
But in the real world of product development, we know that things don't always go according to plan.
Ever.
Right? Requirements change, new information emerges, priorities shift. So how does an Agile team handle these inevitable changes that happen during a sprint?
That's where the flexibility of Agile really comes into play.
Right.
The key is to be adaptable and to have those open lines of communication that we talked about.
So what's the process like when a change request comes in?
So the first step is to evaluate the impact of the change.
You got to figure out how big of a deal it is, right?
Exactly. How will it affect the current sprint goals? Will it introduce any delays or dependencies? Will it require any rework?
And who typically takes the lead on this?
Usually the product owner will lead this evaluation.
Okay.
And then they communicate the implications to the team and the stakeholders.
So it's a collaborative process, right?
Absolutely. Everyone needs to be aware of the change and the potential impact.
And sometimes that might mean adjusting the sprint goals, right?
Yes, sometimes you might need to reprioritize tasks or even descoping some work to accommodate the change.
And that can be a tough decision.
It can be, because you don't want to disrupt the team's flow, but you also need to be responsive to new information.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's say we've made it through the sprint. we've handled all the changes, and now it's time to review what we've accomplished.
Yeah.
So tell me about sprint reviews. What happens during a sprint review?
So the sprint review is a meeting where the team demonstrates the work they've completed during the sprint to the stakeholders.
So it's kind of like a show and tell.
Yeah, it's an opportunity for the team to showcase what they've built, get feedback, and validate their assumptions.
And it's not just a presentation, right?
No, it's very interactive. Stakeholders are encouraged to ask questions, try out the new features, provide their input.
This is a real conversation.
Exactly. And the feedback that's gathered during the sprint review is really valuable.
Because it helps you make sure you're on the right track.
Yeah, it helps to inform the product backlog for future sprints.
So it's all part of that iterative process.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about how Agile teams work, how they plan, how they adapt, how they review their work.
Yeah.
But how do we actually know if an Agile project is successful?
All right, how do we measure that?
What are some of the key metrics that we should be looking at?
So there are a number of key performance indicators, or KPIs, that can give you insight into the health of your Agile project.
Okay, so give me some examples.
So one common KPI is velocity, which measures the amount of work a team can typically complete in a sprint.
So that gives you an idea of their capacity.
Yeah, exactly. It helps you with forecasting and planning.
Okay, what else?
Another important KPI is cycle time, which measures how long it takes for a piece of work to move from the backlog to completion.
So that tells you how efficient your process is.
Exactly. And of course, customer satisfaction is a crucial metric.
That's the ultimate goal, right?
Yeah, you want to make sure that your users are happy with the product.
Right.
And there are various ways to measure customer satisfaction, like surveys, feedback forms, net promoter score.
So it's really important to track these metrics.
Absolutely, because they give you data that you can use to make informed decisions.
Right. It's not just about gut feeling.
It's about having evidence to support your decisions.
And you mentioned earlier those retrospective meetings.
Yeah, those are key for continuous improvement.
So how do those contribute to measuring success?
So retrospectives are all about reflecting on the sprint, identifying what went well, what could be improved, and coming up with actionable steps to make the next sprint better.
So it's a way to learn from your mistakes.
Exactly, and to constantly iterate and get better.
I think that's one of the things I really love about Agile is that focus on continuous improvement.
It's built into the process.
Yeah, it's not about being perfect. It's about constantly striving to get better.
Exactly, and I think that's a healthy mindset to have in any field, really.
All right, so now I want to talk about some of the challenges that can come up when you're actually implementing Agile in the real world.
Because it's not always smooth sailing.
No, it's not. And our source mentions a few specific challenges that are worth discussing.
Yeah.
So one of the things they talk about is resistance to change.
Yeah, that's a common one, especially in organizations that are used to more traditional waterfall methods.
Right, because Agile is a big shift in mindset.
It requires people to be more flexible, more collaborative, more open to change.
So how do you overcome that resistance?
Well, I think education is key. Helping people understand the benefits of Agile, why it's valuable.
Yeah, showing them the why.
Exactly. And providing training and support to help them make the transition.
And I think it's also helpful to start small.
Yeah, don't try to do too much at once.
Right, maybe pilot Agile with one team and then gradually roll it out to others.
Yeah, and celebrate your successes. Show people that Agile can work and that it can deliver results.
Yeah, because people need to see it to believe it sometimes.
Absolutely.
Another challenge that our source mentions is managing rapidly changing requirements.
And that's kind of ironic because Agile's supposed to be all about embracing change.
It is.
But the reality is that it can still be difficult to manage, especially when those changes are coming in fast and furious.
So what are some tips for handling that?
Well, communication is key. Keeping everyone informed about the changes, making sure that everyone understands the impact.
Yeah, and being transparent about why those changes are happening.
Exactly. And being flexible with your planning.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to adjust your sprint goals or your backlog as needed.
And I think it's also important to have a clear process for how you handle change requests.
Yeah, having a defined workflow can help to streamline things.
So that everyone knows what to do when a change comes in.
Right.
Okay. Our source gives a couple of very practical examples of how Agile teams might handle changes during a sprint.
Yeah.
So let's walk through those.
Sure.
So the first example is having to reprioritize within a sprint due to a critical bug.
Yeah, that's never fun.
No, it's not, but it happens.
It does happen. So the first step is to assess the severity of the bug.
You got to figure out how bad it is.
Exactly. Who is it impacting? What functionality is broken? Is it a showstopper?
And
then You need to discuss it with the team. How long will it take to fix? How will it affect the other work in the sprint?
And you probably need to loop in the stakeholders, too.
Yeah, definitely. They need to be aware of the situation and any potential delays.
So it's a collaborative decision, right?
Absolutely. Everyone needs to be on board with the plan.
The second example is managing requirement changes during a sprint because of shifting market demands.
Oh, that's a tough one.
That's a really tough one because now you're not just dealing with a technical issue, you're dealing with a change in strategy.
Right. And potentially a big one.
So how do you approach that?
So in this case, you would probably need to have an emergency backlog refinement session.
Like a huddle.
Yeah, get the product owner, the stakeholders, the key team members together, and really dig into the new market demands.
Understand what's changed and why.
Exactly. And then you need to assess the impact on the current sprint.
Right. Can you still achieve your goals?
Do you need to reprioritize? Do you need to add new tasks? Do you need to descoping something?
And again, communication is key.
Absolutely. You need to make sure everyone understands the changes and the rationale behind them.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about Agile, but I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the bigger picture of how software is built.
Okay.
And that's where the software development life cycle, or SDLC, comes in.
Yeah, the SDLC.
Can you explain what the SDLC is and why it's important for a product manager to understand it?
So the SDLC is basically a roadmap for building and maintaining software. It outlines the different phases of the software development process.
And those phases are...
Typically, it starts with planning, where you define the scope of the project, the requirements, the goals.
Okay.
Then you move into design, where you create the blueprints for the software, the user interface, the architecture.
Then development, where you actually write the code.
Right.
Then testing, where you make sure that the software works as expected.
You got to catch those bugs.
Then deployment, where you release the software to the users.
And finally, maintenance, where you keep the software running smoothly and fix any issues that arise.
So it's the whole shebang.
Yeah, the whole life cycle.
And why is it important for a product manager to understand this?
Well, as a product manager, you're not just responsible for coming up with ideas, you're also responsible for seeing those ideas through to implementation.
Right, you need to understand how things actually get built.
Exactly, and the SDLC gives you that framework. It helps you to communicate with the development team, it helps you to track progress, it helps you ensure that the final product meets the requirements.
So it's not just about the what, it's also about the how.
Exactly.
And it's important to note that the SDLC can be adapted to different methodologies.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all.
So you can use it with Agile, with Waterfall, with whatever approach you choose.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the process of building software now. Let's talk about a really crucial aspect of any successful product, and that is the user experience.
Yeah, UX is everything.
It really is. So how do UI, user interface, and UX, user experience design fit into the whole product management process?
Well, UI and UX are essential for creating products that are both usable and enjoyable to use.
Right, because it's not just about building something that works.
It has to be intuitive. It has to be aesthetically pleasing. It has to meet the user's needs.
So as a product manager, you need to be a champion for good UI and UX.
Absolutely. And that means working closely with designers, conducting user research, getting feedback, testing your designs.
So it's a very collaborative process.
Yeah, very much so.
And it's also an iterative process, right?
Absolutely. You're constantly refining your designs based on feedback and data.
So it's not like you design something once and then you're done.
It's an ongoing process.
And I think that's one of the things that makes product management so interesting.
It's always evolving.
You're always learning. You're always improving.
Yeah, it keeps you on your toes.
All right, let's talk about some general product management concepts that come up a lot in interviews and in the work itself.
Okay.
So one of the things that we've talked about a lot already is user feedback.
Yeah, you can't overstate the importance of user feedback.
Right, it's so crucial. So can you give me a concrete example of how user feedback actually influenced a product's direction?
Sure. Our source mentions a case study where a mobile app was getting a lot of negative feedback about its navigation.
People were finding it confusing.
Yeah, they couldn't find what they were looking for. It was frustrating.
So what did they do?
So they conducted user interviews, they looked at their analytics, and they realized that the navigation structure was just not intuitive.
Okay.
So they completely redesigned it based on the feedback they received, and as a result, they saw a 20% increase in user satisfaction.
Wow, that's significant.
Yeah, it just goes to show that listening to your users can make a huge difference.
All right, another key concept that I want to talk about is the minimum viable product, or MVP.
Yeah, the MVP.
Can you remind us what an MVP is and what are the key considerations when you're defining an MVP for a new product?
Sure. So an MVP is basically the simplest version of your product that you can release to get feedback from real users.
It's not the finished product.
No, it's the bare bones. It's the core features that are essential for solving the user's problem.
And the goal is to get it out there quickly.
Yeah, you want to validate your assumptions, learn what works, what doesn't work, and then iterate based on that feedback.
So it's all about learning and iterating.
Exactly.
And when you're defining an MVP, you need to be really ruthless about prioritizing.
Yeah, you have to ask yourself, what are the absolute must-have features? What can we live without for now?
Because you don't want to overbuild it.
Right, you want to keep it lean so that you can move fast and get feedback.
Okay, so let's talk about another balancing act that product managers have to do, and that is balancing short-term goals with long-term vision.
Yeah, that's a constant struggle.
Right, because you've got to keep the lights on, you've got to deliver results in the short term.
But you also have to be thinking about the big picture.
Exactly. So how do you find that balance?
Well, I think it starts with having a clear product strategy.
Right, knowing where you're going.
Yeah, what's your vision for the product? What are your long-term goals?
And then you can break those long-term goals down into smaller milestones.
Yeah, so that you have a roadmap to follow.
And then you can prioritize your short-term work based on how it contributes to those milestones.
Exactly, so that everything you do is aligned with the overall vision.
And it's important to regularly review and adjust your roadmap.
Yeah, because things change.
The market changes, your priorities change.
So you need to be adaptable.
All right, let's talk about another challenge that product managers face, and that is collaborating with different teams.
Yeah, cross-functional collaboration can be tricky.
Because you're working with people from different backgrounds, with different priorities, with different ways of working.
And sometimes different languages.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are some common challenges that you encounter in cross-functional collaboration, and what are some strategies for overcoming those challenges?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is communication breakdowns.
People aren't on the same page.
Yeah, they're using different terminology. They have different assumptions.
So how do you prevent that?
Well, regular communication is key. Having regular meetings where everyone can share updates, ask questions, raise concerns.
So having those touch points.
Yeah, creating a shared understanding.
And it's also helpful to have shared documentation.
Yeah, having a single source of truth for things like product specs, roadmaps, design guidelines.
So that everyone's working from the same information.
Right.
And I think it's also important to build relationships with the people you're working with.
Absolutely. Get to know them, understand their perspectives, their challenges.
Yeah, because it's not just about the work, it's about the people.
Exactly.
Okay, now what about those situations where there are conflicting opinions within the team?
Ooh, that's always fun.
Right, because not everyone's going to agree all the time.
No, and that's actually a good thing. You want diverse perspectives.
Right, you want people to challenge each other.
But you also need a way to resolve those conflicts.
So how do you do that?
Well, I think the first step is to encourage open and respectful dialogue.
Create a safe space for people to share their opinions.
Exactly. And then you need to listen to each other, really try to understand the other person's perspective.
And sometimes you might need to compromise.
Yeah. Find a solution that works for everyone.
But if you can't reach a consensus, then what?
Well, ultimately, the decision might need to be made by the product manager.
Right. You're the one who's ultimately accountable.
Yeah, but you should always strive to make data-driven decisions.
Right. Don't just go with your gut.
Look at the user feedback.
Yeah.
Look at the analytics. Look at the market research.
And make the decision that you believe is best for the product.
Exactly.
All right, let's move on to some specific product management frameworks that are really helpful to know.
Okay.
So we touched on the Lean Startup earlier, but I want to dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah, the Lean Startup is a great framework.
Can you explain the core principles of Lean Startup and how they apply to product management?
So the Lean Startup is all about validating your assumptions as quickly as possible.
Right, because you don't want to waste time building something that nobody wants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the key is to build a minimum viable product, get it in front of users, and then measure their behavior.
So it's all about learning and iterating.
Exactly. And the Lean Startup emphasizes a build, measure, learn feedback loop.
So you build something, you measure the results, you learn from those results, and then you iterate.
Exactly. And you keep doing that until you have a product that meets the user's needs.
Another framework that I want to talk about is jobs to be done, or JTBD.
Yeah, JTBD is interesting.
It's a different way of looking at things. So how does JTBD differ from other approaches?
So JTBD is all about understanding the underlying motivations of your users.
Right, not just what they're doing, but why they're doing it.
Exactly. So instead of focusing on demographics or features, you focus on the job that the user's trying to get done.
The job they're hiring your product to do.
Exactly. And by understanding that job, you can create a product that truly meets their needs.
Okay, so give me an example.
So let's say you're building a messaging app.
Okay.
The traditional approach might be to focus on features like group chat, video calls, stickers.
Right.
But the JTBD approach would be to ask, why are people using messaging apps in the first place? What job are they trying to get done?
Right. What's the underlying need?
And you might find that the job is to stay connected with friends and family.
Okay.
So your focus shifts from features to creating an experience that makes it easy and enjoyable to stay connected.
I see. So it's a more user-centric approach.
Yeah, it's about understanding the user's context and their motivations.
All right, let's talk about the Kano model.
The Kano model is a classic.
It's been around for a while, but it's still really relevant. So can you explain how the Kano model helps you to prioritize features?
Sure. So the Kano model categorizes features into three types: basic, performance, and delight.
Okay.
Basic features are the ones that users expect your product to have. If they're missing, users will be dissatisfied. But if they're present, they don't really increase satisfaction.
So they're like the table stakes.
Yeah, exactly. They're the must-haves.
Performance features are the ones that directly correlate with user satisfaction.
So the more of these features you have, the happier your users will be.
Okay.
And then delight features are the ones that are unexpected. They go above and beyond what users expect.
So they're like the wow factor.
Exactly. And they can really differentiate your product.
So how does this help you prioritize?
Well, it helps you to understand which features are going to have the biggest impact on user satisfaction.
Right, so you want to make sure you're covering the basic features first.
Yeah, those are non-negotiable.
Then you can focus on the performance features.
And then if you have time and resources, you can sprinkle in some delight feature.
Really make your product stand out.
Exactly.
All right, let's talk about design thinking.
Design thinking is a really popular framework these days.
It's everywhere. So how is design thinking applied to product management?
So design thinking is a human-centered approach to problem solving.
It's all about empathy.
Yeah. Understanding the user's needs, their pain points, their motivations.
And it's an iterative process.
Very much so. It involves going through cycles of ideation, prototyping, testing, and feedback.
So you're constantly refining your ideas based on what you're learning from users.
Exactly. And design thinking is often used in the early stages of product development.
When you're trying to define the problem and come up with potential solutions.
Yeah, it's a great way to generate innovative ideas.
All right, last framework I want to talk about is GIST.
GIST is all about alignment.
Okay, so explain what GIST is and why it's valuable.
So GIST stands for goals, ideas, step projects, and tasks.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is. But it's a very structured approach to planning and execution.
Okay.
So you start with your high-level goals. What are you trying to achieve?
The big picture.
Yeah, then you break those goals down into smaller step projects.
Which are basically like mini projects.
Exactly. And then you break those step projects down into even smaller tasks.
So it's like a hierarchy.
Exactly.
Right.
And by having this clear hierarchy, everyone knows what they're working on and how it contributes to the overall goals.
So it's all about clarity and alignment.
Yeah, making sure everyone's on the same page and working towards the same objectives.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in terms of product management frameworks.
Yeah, we've touched on a lot of different approaches.
Now let's shift gears and talk about product metrics.
Yeah, the numbers.
Right, because you can't just build a product and hope for the best.
You need to measure your success.
You need to understand how your product is performing.
So, what are some of the key metrics that a product manager should be tracking and analyzing?
That's a big question because there are so many different metrics you could track.
It really depends on your product and your goals.
Right, but there are some common ones that are always relevant.
Yeah. So, for example, user acquisition. How many new users are you getting?
Right, how are people finding your product?
Are your marketing campaigns working? Are people sharing your product with their friends?
Okay, what else?
User retention. How many of those new users are sticking around? Are they coming back? Are they using your product regularly? Are they?